Is there anything wrong with adding ice to Laphroaig?
No. Here's my take on ice. You know, back in the day when the boys were making the whiskey up in the hills with a small still by the stream, by a burn, they would, as the new spirit's coming off the still, they'd scoop a few stones out of the stream, pour that spirit over the stones, Scotch on the rocks. Now there are companies today that are producing whiskey stones where you put them in the freezer, you bring them out, put them in your glass, and then pour the whiskey over the stone, and the convectional cooling cools the whiskey. And here's the key thing for me, without changing the flavor profile. The problem with ice today is I think there's really no such thing as a neutral ice. There's some technology that's producing some very, very clean ice, but to me it really changes very dramatically the flavor profile. Right. You take a bottle of whiskey, you put it in the freezer, and then you pull it out and pour it. It's going to pour very heavy, very viscous, very thick, and when you nose it, it's going to be a much narrower flavor profile. Whiskey, like wine, opens up. It reacts with air. Now, some of these lighter style Highland whiskies that are very delicate, delicate nuances, you add ice to it, you'll lose a lot of those delicate notes. Laphroaig is a pretty...
Simon, you came with something a bit special today.
I did. We were able to track down this bottle, which is a 1969 10-year-old Laphroaig.
Wow.
This is, the cork was in great shape, and we had it verified, and we've used this, we took this to a couple of tastings for friends of Laphroaig, because, well, actually the one that we did was, there's Laphroaig Live, we did recently this in 2011. John Campbell, our distillery manager, was doing a live tasting in Australia, because one of the founding members of the distillery was the Johnston family, and there is a Johnston relative in Australia. So we did a tasting with the great granddaughter of one of the Johnstons, and so we were talking to him in Australia. He was a day ahead of us, and we had this whiskey from the 1969. So from 50 years ago, there was a lot of time travel going on, and I think that's something certainly for whiskey that is really a key component, that you play with time when you're drinking these whiskeys, and not only does it take you back, it slows things down for you. You know, that's the beautiful thing I appreciate about single malt scotches. You know, it took 10 years to make this whiskey. We ask that you take more than 10 seconds to enjoy it.
Oh, I feel bad.
You know, and during that time, you're making new friends. You're reacquainting with old. It's about the spirit within the spirit, and this is the spirit of Laphroaig from the 1950s. Our distillery, as I mentioned, the Johnston brothers, who were farmers back in the late 18th century, farming on Islay, at a time when there were 8,000 people on the island. Today there's only 3,000 people and 8 distilleries.
How many sheep?
There's about, well, if we've got 3,000 people, we've got about 8,000 sheep on the island there. Yeah. So the Johnston brothers farmed the island, and as many farmers did with the grain, with the barley, they were making extra whiskey. They were making whiskey. They found they were making more money making the whiskey, so they stopped farming altogether, went into whiskey making legally in 1825. On the bottle it says established 1815. Right. There's a few years of missing records there. We are actually celebrating our 200th year anniversary, 2015, at Laphroaig. Of course, that's the illegal 200-year anniversary, so there'll be all sorts of illegal fun, and but with some really interesting bottlings. And then after that, it was Mr. Hunter who, at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, he traveled all about the world, went to Sweden, went to the United States, secured barrels, secured a position for Laphroaig to be served, to be sold as medicine during Prohibition. You know, we always talk about the medicinal iodine quality of Laphroaig. well, that greatly aided us to be able to continue to sell it during Prohibition. And then after that, Miss Bessie Williamson came to the distillery back in 1932. She was a secretary to Mr. Hunter, and then she became managing director in the 50s and held that position until 1972. So for 40 years, this woman had a profound impact on the whiskies being made at Laphroaig. She was the only single malt distillery owner in Scotland in the 20th century. And so this 1969 Laphroaig, which was then distilled 1959.
Under the ownership of a woman.
Yes. And just a lovely whiskey.
It smells lovely.
Yeah.
It smells a bit different than Laphroaig can today.
Yes. You're gonna there will be using more sherry casks and a mixture of sherry and bourbon for this 10-year. So
it smells fresh and
slange.
Slange.
You know, I would say use all 5 senses in tasting the whiskey. We look at the golden amber color of the whiskey. We nose the smoke and sweet. There's that taste. There's the mouthfeel, and then there's that sound of silence as you're enjoying one of the finest spirits in the world.
This is still Laphroaig.
Absolutely.
This is very much Laphroaig.
Yeah.
There's something very unique about this aroma and taste profile of Laphroaig.
Yeah. It's to me that speaks to the quality and the craftsmanship and the care that goes into making this whiskey. The fact that we can taste a whiskey that was produced 60 years ago, and you go, yeah, that's Laphroaig.
Were the stills in the same shape? Were they the same, or were they in the same shape?
They were the same shape, yes. Right. One of the difference would have been the fact that they were at that time using worm tubs instead of shell and tube condensers. Okay. So you're getting more copper contact today than you were getting back then. And mashing times, fermentation times might be slightly different as well. The basic shape of the still, though, has not changed. Amazing.
Are the fermenters in wood? Are they in stainless steel? Does that make any difference?
We are in stainless steel. We've been in stainless steel since the 60s. Okay. When there was a change in ownership, it's much more efficient to work with the stainless steel fermenters for us. You know, it varies. The practice is different from distillery to distillery, but ultimately, for keeping unwanted bacteria out, keeping it a clean, neutral space to be able to ferment in, that's a key component for us.
Well, this is a very special moment. Thank you very much for bringing this bottle here. How many bottles could you get?
As of right now, I believe there's maybe a case of it that's available.
Available to who?
To whoever would like to purchase. If there are bottles for sale, these are
Well, this is a piece of history. Was a 10-year-old already an old whiskey back then? Was it some sort of a standard?
It was.
Was there any 18-year-old back then?
At that time, they were not really. They weren't selling it. The 10-year was the standard because that was pretty much what was being used for blending purposes, and so the 10-year is what we've had through the years. The 18 and the 15, those really didn't come into play until the 70s, you know, the late 60s, when whiskies like Glenfiddich and Glenlivet were now making single malts popular.
Malts. Right, right.
So as a result of that, then all of the single malt distilleries were then looking ahead to produce whiskies that could be older. For us at Ardmore, this distillery was built by the William Teacher family, by his son Adam Teacher in 1898. And interestingly enough, this whiskey, 99.9% of this of Ardmore has always gone into blends, or maybe a barrel or two is sold to independent bottlers. But when Jim Beam purchased Laphroaig and Teachers almost 5 years ago now, with that purchase they got the Ardmore distillery, and they discovered this fantastic single malt that nobody had been tasting. This is a smoky Highland whiskey. In terms of your standard Highland whiskies, your Dalmores, your Glenmorangies, your Dalwhinnies, the smoke in the phenols are 2 to 3 parts per million, which is negligible. This is at 15 parts per million, so this is about 5 times smokier than your standard Highland.
But now, still slightly, just slightly peated in the world of smoky single malt Scotch whiskey.
Exactly, and as I had been describing perhaps when we first started, it's the difference between sitting around a campfire in the forest versus sitting around a campfire on the beach. And the phenols for Laphroaig are about 47 parts per million. So, you know, this is a third of what you'll find with Laphroaig. Ardmore, the standard bottling we have is called the traditional cask, where we're aging in American oak 5 to 13 years, and then we take that whiskey and we put it into the smaller barrels, traditional casks. Sounds familiar?
Yeah.
It is quarter cask.
All right.
They are the quarter casks that we're using to age it in. So you get that creamy quality. But Ardmore has long had a creamy quality to this whiskey, which goes into Teacher's Highland Cream. So that creamy quality, well, the descriptor on the bottle of Teacher's Highland Cream actually goes back to the early days when sherry was being sold. It was milk, and then there was cream to give it to raise the quality and the value of the spirit. So there was a correlation with the sherry industry at that time.
Is Ardmore distillery that can be visited today?
It can be. We are in the process of putting in a visitor center. The best thing, as I was mentioning earlier, it's always best to call ahead.
Of course.
They will most usually open the doors for you and give you a fantastic tour. And Ardmore is a classic example of a Victorian-style distillery, as opposed to the old farm distilleries that you'll find with Laphroaig. But it is a beautiful distillery, one of the largest actually in Scotland. We're producing about 5 million litres of whiskey a year. And actually until the early 90s, we were still a coal-fired distillery. And then because of health and safety, they've removed all the coal fires and they've put in internal coil, steam coil heat.
All right. What's the shape of the still there?
They're very tall. They are also they're twice the size of the Laphroaig stills. So very tall stills with a line arm that is tailing away. You're getting really light, sweet quality, but also one of the key components is about Ardmore. It's one of the highest distilleries in Scotland. So at a higher altitude, you get a very light, clean spirit coming off the stills.
Atmospheric pressure? What is it?
Well, it's yes. It's a drier climate as well. Dalwhinnie, I think, is another example of that. Here in America, Stranahan's in Denver, where they're producing at a mile high. It produces a slightly different style spirit because of the elevation and because of the dryness of the quality.
When do you drink Ardmore?
Ardmore's a good year-round whiskey because it is a lighter style. I find a lot of Irish whiskey drinkers enjoy the Ardmore. For folks who are interested, who are moving beyond the glens and are interested in a slightly smokier whiskey, but don't want the really heavy peaty style of an Islay whiskey, I always like to recommend the Ardmore. Also out in the market, there is very limited quantities. There's an Ardmore 25-year-old and there's an Ardmore 30-year.